people have this negative reaction to it and yet this regret for not learning it. So there's a very complicated relationship with the language, but I don't think the language itself is complicated.
This is the Irish Stew podcast, and I'm Martin Nutty. And that was the voice of Mollie Guidera, language activist, educator, founder of Irish with Mollie, and author of the recently published The Gaeilge Guide. She's back on Irish Stew for a second conversation, and if you caught her first visit back in November 2023, you'll know she has a rare gift. She makes you feel like the door to the language is always open, and you just never noticed. Today, we get into the book, The Boom in Irish Language Interest Globally, what Hiberno English tells us about who we are, and the legacy of Moncton Magan. You'll notice I'm flying solo this week as John couldn't make this recording, but the mellifluous-voiced one will be back with us on our next episode. Before we start, a big Gurumila Mahagut to Irish Central, who every week spreads the word on the podcast. For all things Irish, make sure you visit irishcentral.com. Agus anish, seo Mollie. Mollie, tá fáilte rót.
Gurv míle magat. Thanks a million. It's brilliant to be back. Delighted to be here.
Since we last talked, there's two big things, at least, that I've observed as I've tracked you across the internet, read your emails. You have written a book called The Gaeilge Guide, which was published by Hachette Books, and that book was nominated for an On Post Award, so congratulations for that.
Thanks a million, yeah.
So tell me about the genesis of that book. How does it fit into everything else you're doing?
I suppose it was a logical next step. When you think of my community growing so quickly, we're now the fastest growing Gaeltacht in the world. I have more than 10,000 students in over 75 countries. And a lot of it is on social media. So if you're not on TikTok or Instagram, Facebook, then you might not know, about the Gaeltacht, let's say, this play on words, the Gaeltacht, the predominantly Irish-speaking part of the internet. But I think bringing it to the page and bringing my research and all these years of unearthing and unraveling words and meaning and relevance in the language that meant so much to me and to so many people, I think it made sense to publish it and to have a printed copy of all of these things I had been researching and so curious about and so passionate about for the last few years. So I've actually always dreamt about being a writer. It's probably my number one dream in life to publish a book since I was really young. Even I remember being 12 years old, being disappointed in myself for not being a novelist. But I always thought it would be fiction. And I was actually actively writing a novel a few years ago before I started Irish with Mollie. And Irish with Mollie, the brand and the business, kind of took over my life. It's been so much work and so much energy that I left writing behind. And then I was approached by different publishers over a year ago, and they put this idea to me, and I started to see how obvious it was. And I think it's obvious to people who create things online. That's the way publishing is going for certain nonfiction categories, that you have so much content, so much material. It's a great way to share it and also to bring it into households and further afield without being solely in social media. So it was an amazing process. I learned a lot, and I'm delighted that it's reached so many people and people are really engaging with it and feeling like it's speaking to them, because as we were saying, it's a story about colonization, about connection, about community, about shame, about feeling maybe, I'm Irish, but I didn't grow up in Ireland, or I'm Irish, but I don't speak Irish. Who am I and what does this mean to me?
Clearly, identity is becoming a bigger and bigger thing, I think, for many people. And we seem to be living at a moment in time where the world is in flux. And we're trying to figure out maybe a better way forward, that those things, the rules that were essentially created after World War II, now seem to be questioned. And Ireland is an unusual place because it is on the edge. It's on the edge of the Atlantic. It's on the edge between America and Europe. America has a huge influence in Ireland, but it's also part of Europe. And there's a lot of tension between those two places. And so Irish identity now is, are we going to be American? Are we going to be Europe? Or are we going to be something truly different? And how does the language fit into that? Is the question that maybe some people are starting to ask in terms of identity. What does it mean to be Irish going forward? Or bigger question, can you really be Irish and not be able to speak the language? I have my own answer to that, but I want to hear what you're thinking of.
It is a fascinating question because in many ways, you would think the Irish language being so interwoven with the way we think and laugh and breathe and connect and the way we speak, Hiberno English, it's all deeply influenced by the Irish language. And yet, it's not that normal for a modern Irish person living in Ireland to be fluent in the language. So people might say, are you really Irish if you don't play GAA, the Gaelic Athletic Games? Are you really Irish if you don't play trad music? Are you really Irish if you haven't emigrated to Australia? So there's so many facets of modern Ireland that don't fit with ancient Indigenous Irish culture. So it's interesting because now and then I get a bit of grief online for showing like an image of Black or brown people speaking Irish. Join my courses, people all over the world. And people say, oh, real Ireland is dead and gone. And I say, maybe you're not aware of this, but 60% of my students are not born in Ireland, not white-skinned, not that makes you Irish, but the Irish language is open to everyone. And there are people learning for the magic and wisdom and beauty and depth of the language. And they might not have any ancestry, maybe never have visited Ireland in their life, but they get the benefits of learning this language. And I think being Irish is having a human and open and loving spirit and being able to reckon with what happened to us in terms of oppression and colonization and being othered. So the Irish legacy goes back to the genocide, the famine, starvation, poverty, and indentured servants, and all of the history that we see coming back again and being reflected in situations like in Palestine. So I think Irish people know to stand up for what is right. And a bit like James Connolly, one of the key figures of Irish independence, said, let no Irishman throw a stone at the foreigner lest he hit his own clansmen. So it's a bit like look at how the Irish were treated throughout history and realize that it's Irish to be welcoming and to be welcomed. We are so loved around the world. It's such a privilege to be Irish and have that amazing connection. People seem to really value the Irish sense of humor and the entrepreneurship and the hardworking nature and all of these great things. But I think you're right. Things are changing fast and people are a bit confused about what it means to be Irish. So it's interesting. I don't think I'm more Irish for being able to speak the language, but I think there is a lot of the beauty of the Irish psyche and nature within the language that we can have access to. And it's interesting the way when I started Irish with Mollie and started teaching, I was thinking, let's go back. Let's go back to a pure, beautiful brilliance of the way the Celtic spirituality aspect of the world, like all mythology. And now with Catherine Connolly, our new president, bringing it forward and Kneecap and all of these young people revitalizing the culture of Ireland, we think actually the Irish language is about a radical new future. It's more about how do we want to be and how do we see ourselves in the world and how do we want to lead, these kind of things. So it's really not so much about the past. It's really about inspiring us for the future.
Yeah, I think if you attach a language to the past, it'll be left in the past. And so it's important to understand that vitality is an essential element to that, and it must grow with the reality of the world that is being experienced. So to try to consign it to some kind of archival storage is a huge mistake. And sometimes you will see commentary about words that have been made up in Irish. It's a bit ridiculous, and it goes to mindset around the language. So let's talk about mindset. In your book, talking about people regretting not being able to speak Irish, that there was a shame. Noira, I think, is the right word for it. A shame that revolves around about the inability to learn Irish. And one of the things that I was also struck by is your delivery of this information through your book is primarily trid berla, through English. When I was learning Irish in school a long time ago, it was required, certainly in secondary school, that everything had to go through Irish. A word of English was not to be spoken. And believe me, my Irish was not very good. So it was a source of immense frustration. Just tell me what it means in English, explain it to me in English, and then teach it to me in Irish. So does what you're doing in the book reflect a different way to approach Irish that's being taught in the schools, just recognizing, hey, we're primarily an English-speaking country, and to learn Irish, we have to meet people in the language where they're at?
100%. Yeah, I think people use words like, oh, she's a Gaeilge, but she doesn't shove it down your throat. Or people say Irish was beaten into them. And this very aggressive and violent language is reminiscent of being colonized and being forced to do something. A lot of people say we were forced to learn Irish. It is a compulsory subject. And yet what I want to do is sprinkle it. We're sprinkling seeds. On the one hand, recognizing that, yeah, we're fluent English speakers. English is, for many people, our first language in Ireland. But at the same time, to make it more accessible, to make it more inclusive, it's very difficult to learn something through the language that you're trying to learn. Even nowadays, there are books being published about Irish grammar. And even the most basic aspects for a beginner are explained through Irish, which makes no sense whatsoever. I know babies and children learn English through English, for example, but I think as an adult, it can be more accessible, more convenient, more engaging, and more effective to learn it through the language that you already speak, so that someone is gently explaining it and doing it in a way that is entertaining and enlivening and relevant for you. So that's really what I try to capture with my work. And I suppose also because people have such a reticence or even reaction to Irish that can be very instinctive. People have this negative reaction to it and yet this regret for not learning it. So even Irish with Mollie is not called Gaeilge le Máirín. I think sometimes when you see an Irish name or an Irish word, people can actually feel, oh, I can't understand that. That's beyond me. Even though Irish people are adamant that they're not beginners because they spent 14 years at school learning the language. So there's a very complicated relationship with the language, but I don't think the language itself is complicated.
So let me ask you this. Obviously, I'm a different generation to you. I was in school back in the 70s. Do you have a sense of how the language is being taught? My generation, many people will say they resented it. It was beaten into them. It was mandatory. It was a barrier to be overcome. It was painful. And of course, there's PEG. People are still talking about PEG, but it hasn't been on the curriculum in our own for 25 years. Do you have a sense of how the delivery is working in schools now compared to maybe back in my era?
I think things are slowly improving. At least young teachers are getting in touch with me. They're inspired. They want to improve. They want to use the language in a more casual, spontaneous and natural way. And yet the curriculum hasn't really caught up. So it's still quite dry and it's quite formulaic and there's like a script. The Irish education system is really academic and really pressurizing. And I think that was part of Ireland coming out of poverty and saying, if you're getting this many points in your leaving cert, you should be a doctor or a lawyer instead of do what makes you feel good. Also, because it's such an expensive place to live, like many places around the world now, you need a good job, you need a good salary, you need to work hard at school, instead of focusing on maybe your passions and your purpose and what makes your heart sing, etc. In school, it seems, yeah, the syllabus still has a lot of work to do, whereas in Irish society, in advertising, on public transport, on the streets, you're hearing more Irish than ever. A lot of immigrants to Ireland learning Irish, feeling proud to learn, full of respect for Ireland. A lot of Ukrainians are in touch with me about how grateful they feel to Irish families for taking them in. And they want to express this because they realize how important language is, because Ukrainian has had a similarly parallel history with an oppressor. And it's a very interesting time. I think people are shifting their perception of what language is in general. And I think we're getting there. If you're walking around Dublin today, you'll see bilingual signage everywhere, way more than ever. You'll listen to Irish on the radio. People who never spoke Irish before on TV, radio, even friends and family, they're throwing in a cúpla focal, a couple of words. So it's this normalization that Douglas Hyde, our first president, spoke about. We have to normalize the usage of our language, and that's really happening. So that's very hopeful.
Yeah, speaking of Douglas Hyde, and of course, he was the first president of Ireland and a noted academic in terms of language. And revisiting what we were talking about earlier about the educational system, let's say in the beginning of the state, I think a lot of it was colored by the absolute rejection of Berla or English. So to teach Irish, you couldn't possibly teach it through English because that was the language of oppression. And I think part of the dream, maybe in the beginning of the state, was the state would be a monoglot Irish-speaking country. And that was incredibly impractical because there was so much immigration. And to be a monoglot speaker and arrive in America or England would have been a disaster. As a matter of fact, we know that happened. That was certainly part of the big shift in language in the 19th century, because in the 19th century, more people spoke Irish in Ireland than they spoke English. I think to understand, let's call it the failure, maybe, to have a more common usage of the language, you have to understand some of these threads that are unique to the Irish experience. I don't know if that gels with what you were thinking.
I think so. I think that's a really valid reason why Irish was taught the way it was. And also that teaching methodology wasn't researched back then. They didn't have the tools, the techniques, the academic research that we have now. So even my teaching qualification is from Cambridge, and I did the CELTA, which is a Certificate of English Language Teaching for Adults. And I learned so much in that course about linguistics and about classroom management and lots of different things. But it really helped me apply that to Irish in ways that I hadn't seen Irish being taught. And I think that helps immensely to understand different learner types as well. Kinesthetic learners, visual learners, auditory learners. Everyone learns in their own way. Whereas when I was going to school in the 90s, unless you were learning in one way, you weren't good at school. And there were 90% of the people didn't learn in that way. They struggled. There were all these challenges with attention or with just materials not being made accessible enough in so many ways, or the teachers not knowing how to explain things or how to grade language. So I think, thankfully, technology is improving and ways of teaching are being illuminated so that people have more of a chance than ever to learn the language. But also, I suppose it was the Catholic Church back then, the Christian Brothers teaching the language. And then it was so tied to this strict authoritarian Catholic way of controlling people, as well as associating that with the language, which wasn't a healthy way for people to feel their own culture. It was a mishmash. I write about it in the book that Mary McAleese said we went from one oppressor to the other, the British state to the Catholic Church. So it's no wonder we have these shackles that we need to free ourselves from to connect with what is truly the essence of the language.
My father was educated in a Gaelic medium school or an Irish medium school in Parnell Square, a place called Coláiste. And I don't think that was a pleasant experience. He had a good understanding of the language, was never used at home. And there was a lot of psychological baggage, I think, with that experience. So it's sadly unfortunate. But I want to boomerang back to the book because I think there's a lot of interesting threads. And I've read the book and enjoyed it immensely because it feels like it grounded me in a deeper commitment into improving my Irish. But let's talk about fluency. I am far from lífach, as they say, but I am a former athlete. And as an athlete, ultimately, you have to come to terms with your own mediocrity. There's only one person that stands at the top of the podium in the Olympic Games. Not everybody gets a gold medal. But what I did learn during my athletic career was to embrace, let's call it the journey, which is a much overused word, but the opportunity to improve. So when can one say one is a Gaeilge, which is the closing chapter of your book? So let's talk about what it means to be a Gaeilge, what it means to be Líofach.
Yeah, I suppose a Gaeilge, the definition is an Irish speaker. And actually, in some dictionaries, it's classified as an Irish learner. So when I was a teenager going to the Gaeltacht, the Irish speaking parts of Ireland, for an immersive and strict summer college experience, I was kicked out my first year because I spoke a few words of English. But we would have called the local people who lived there, who only spoke Irish, Gaeilgeoirí. And then I only realized recently, within the last year, that they called us Gaeilgeoirí because we were the Irish learners. So it's very interesting, I think, also the power, the weight, and the burden that some words hold. That now and then, if people, I can just sense they don't really get what I'm doing, some people, or even if I'm on the radio talking to the presenter, they might not really care about Irish. Maybe they had a bad experience and they say, "So you're a Gaeilgeoir then?" And you can feel this sense of, Gaeilgeoir in Ireland is like loaded with, oh, you think you're better than us, or something like, I don't know, you have this access to another world, or it's a bit useless what you're doing, or I don't know. There's a lot of negativity and a lot of jealousy or misconception associated with the word. And yet people learning would love to call themselves a Gaeilgeoir. And then you are a Gaeilgeoir because you're learning actively and you're trying to use as much as you can. So I would say if you love Irish, and it does belong to you, you are a Gaeilgeoir. And it's not something that you're limited from or restricted from. But it doesn't mean that you have to be fluent. It doesn't mean that you have to reach a certain level. In fact, fluency is a myth. It's a bit like you were saying, and it's a great comparison, being an athlete. It always feels better when you're working out consistently, when you're working towards your goals. If you are, for example, a track runner, if you only do it once a week or once a month, you're going to be stiff every time you run. But if you're doing it every second day or every third day or every day, and you have a consistent training plan, it's going to feel better and better because you're finding satisfaction in the effort and even in the challenges and realizing, wow, now I can run this far or at this pace. Same thing with language learning. You need to really persevere, have patience and practice. And mindset is the main thing. I used to have people saying, oh, I'm 85. Am I too old? No, I have students who are over 100. Recently, I had someone who said, can I start? I'm 32. I was like, you're 32. Like, you're young. Whatever age you are, you can do it. And it's worth it. And if you believe you're too old, you're too thick, your memory isn't good, whatever, then you're holding yourself back. You have to believe to receive. I know it's very cheesy, but it is true. It is completely true. And I've seen it time and time again. If you believe it's going to click and you put in the work and you follow the program, I guarantee you'll be coming back saying, wow, I surprised myself. I'm impressed with myself. I've made such progress.
Yeah, I think it's mindset. And I think you alluded to the fact how, let's say, adult learners that came up through the Irish educational system to some degree feel Noira, to use that word again, shame that they are not Líofach fluent because they've had so much time in the classroom. Now, the chances are it wasn't particularly effective time, but there's still that to overcome. And I think some other point that I think you maybe made the last time you were with us on the podcast, you suggested that the people that were offshore, that were not educated in Ireland, do not bring baggage with them from the Irish educational experience. Now, I'm not here trying to trash the Irish educational experience. It's in many respects it made me the person that I am because of its quality. But there was failures in that particular area. But I want to switch to setting goals and meaningful goals. In other words, stop worrying about whether you're Líofach or whatever, right? You can work towards something. So I went on a diet over the past couple of months where I'm trying to improve my understanding of Irish, but also its role within the country. So I read your book, obviously, which I enjoyed immensely. I also read a book called Coming Home by a gentleman called Michael McCahan. who was a guy based in Central America, a journalist writing about Colombia, and I think, I'm not sure, maybe in Central America as well as Colombia, and talking about his language journey. He spoke Spanish fluently, but he didn't speak Irish fluently, and the challenges of that. Following his instruction to listen to Radio na Gaeltachta a few days a week. Do I understand everything I hear? No, but I hear words, and I'm like, oh, let me look that up. And I'll use Google Translate and bang it in there and see how can I understand what that word is. And so everything is incremental, building one thing on top of another. And on some level, as an athlete, I learned this, you need to be humble. And you need to have humility to be able to learn, to understand. Yeah, there's more to learn. So I think mindset, is really key. And my goal is to take some of these TEG exams, and maybe our listeners don't know what that is. It's called, I think, Testus Yorpach na Gaeilge. In other words, the European Certificate of Irish. So one of my goals this year is to take one of those tests and work my way through there. But that's because that's how I approach things. I want kind of like a little bit of a stamp of approval for my efforts. But are there other pathways that I should be taking? Obviously, register for Irish with Mollie, but there's many pathways to the language, right?
Definitely. And I think what you're doing is really the right way to go. And to remind learners that it's very normal to say, okay, I want to be fluent. I want to speak. I want to have a conversation. I want to live my life through Irish, or I want to visit Ireland or visit the Gaeltacht and be able to live with a family and do everything in Irish. How long will that take? Instead of asking that, it's more, what do I need to live? I need to know how to order a pint or a coffee. I need to know how to introduce myself, how to count people and things, how to talk about my job, my work, my hobbies, my family, how to write a letter, simple, useful, basic things. And then set goals, like you said. Say, okay, this week I want to learn 1 to 10 and 10 different colors. And I know that sounds like an easy enough goal if you're working 30 minutes a day for a week, but take it easy and be soft on yourself and toga boogie and say, I'll just try for that and then I'll be delighted with myself. And that kind of momentum really builds. And then the student is able to take on a bit more and challenge themselves. And if you lose the run of yourself and you miss a week or a month, who cares? Start again. You can always start again. So I think it's really helpful to have these goals, like listening to the radio or saying, I want to be able to understand a GAA match. Not sure how many people would understand a GAA match all in Irish, but you'll get the energy anyway, the vibes. Or maybe there's lots of new short story books and even kids' books. If you go on Shopaljower, bookshop.ie, it's a brilliant resource. My courses, of course, there's lots of different resources now available online. There's one called Lay Anish, meaning read now, with different bands. So like total beginner, elementary, working your way up to intermediate. So it's brilliant to see how the internet has democratized the language and allowed people to get more creative and create new resources and new engaging materials. So whatever your goals are, I think the TEG is a brilliant goal. You'll find those exams on teg.ie. And it's a great way, like you say, to receive feedback on what level am I? What can I do? Because on the website, it'll tell you, so A1 is total beginner, but it means if you get your A1, it means you're able to introduce yourself, have a simple conversation about the weather, for example, or your feelings. And I think it's the way forward. It's the common European framework of languages, which is not the way we were taught at school, which we still see Europe as the continent, as if we're not the continent, we're just an island. So I think it's an interesting way to position the language in a wider frame of languages, because it is an official EU language and it's worth holding on to. I think what's happened is some people see Irish as this mystical, made up, magical language that's not really relevant to modern life, but it is very appropriate and helpful to how we want to live and a better way of living and being in the world.
Yeah, and I think there's more crack to be had through Irish than maybe Fridberla, so to speak. One of the elements that plays out consistently through your book is the nature of English spoken in Ireland, which is commonly referred to now as Hiberno English. Now, interestingly, when I grew up in Ireland, we never used that term. You either spoke like an educated person, which meant essentially you didn't speak Hiberno English. So let's explain a little bit to our listeners. So my father, who's now no longer with us, I recall often coming in from working on the land and would arrive in the kitchen where my mother was. And he would say in English to my mother, "Is the dinner not ready yet?" Which is a construction you would never hear in America, and I'm sure you would never hear in England. But if you say it in Gaeilge, in Irish, it sounds quite normal. Nach bhfuil an dinner ré fós would be a normal. And it struck me as somebody that had gone to live in America and then coming back into Ireland and hearing that, like, that sounds odd. So tell me about other odd things, because I think that's an example of Brno English. It's a direct translation from
That's a
Irish.
great example. And I
Mhm.
do think one of the fastest ways to start understanding Irish is to think in Hiberno English. If you have that opportunity, if you live in Ireland, if you live in an Irish community, and you hear people saying things like, "Oh, I'm only after talking to Martin,"
Mhm.
or "She's given out to me," or "How was the Christmas?" Even things like "What age are you?" Like, we don't say "How old are you?" We say "What age are you?" because it comes from Cénishu, literally "What age are you?" So Hiberno English is a way that we preserved and protected the language in centuries of not being able to use it freely, or maybe learning it badly, that we could think and speak in our native language, because it's a pretty shocking reality to imagine suddenly being forced into an English speaking sphere that Irish people had to suddenly learn. And English was beaten into Irish people. Irish people believed that Irish was beaten into them, but English was beaten into them. And there are so many beautiful remnants of Irish, the language, in our dialect of Hiberno English. It helps us immensely. Like you mentioned, the use of the definite article, the. So it would be like, "She has the COVID," or "the dinner's on the table." And we talk about how in Irish, that definite article is used a lot more than it is in English. It's just more normal because it's just a different language with its own rules and features. And other things like, we don't pluralize when we're counting things. So we would say 3 cats, 4 dog, instead of 3 cats and 4 dogs in English. And that's why we say 5 mile down the road when we're speaking Hiberno English. So all of this, there's structure. I have the book read, I have the dinner made, this kind of using the verbal adjective. So it comes into our syntax. And yet, because of shame, and because you mentioned this educated mindset that people are superior or inferior because of the way they speak, this has infiltrated Irish society in a way, saying, "Oh, I do be doing that." People go, "Oh, that's not right. That's not a correct way to speak. That's bad English." Yeah, we've been brought up to believe that, but it comes from Irish, like "Bíam ag surfáil," I do be surfing, or "Nach míon tú ag dulgaí on school," don't you be going to school. So it's a bit like with vernacular or African American vernacular English. Lots of ways people speak in that dialect are considered bad or poor English. But really, it's a way of speaking that a community have adopted, and it evolves over time, and it shouldn't be demonized. But it is interesting because even as an English teacher, I taught English for many years before teaching Irish, that my Irish English was looked down on in different schools. I taught for International House and British Council, and they would say, "Oh, we pronounce the letter or like ah." And I'm like, "Doesn't work like that for me. It's or." And we don't speak like that in Ireland. It's just a different way of thinking and speaking. And like you said, it's way more crack. It's a lot freer, and it's a very different way of seeing the world as well.
I'm reminded we lost a stalwart in the Irish American community in New York last year, a gentleman by the name of Malachi McCourt. His brother Frank is probably the better known. There was 5 brothers, I believe, in the family, and Frank is probably better known because he wrote Angela's Ashes and his. But Malachi was his brother. Malachi's used a quote. Now, I think it might belong to Wilde, but something to the effect of the Irish took the language of their oppression and turned it into a thing of beauty, meaning our kind of flavor of Hiberno English and the more playful nature of Irish I think, enabled a whole different way of communicating in English. And we can judge its effectiveness, if you will, by the extraordinary achievement by Irish literary figures, not just in the past where you talk about Yeats or Joyce or Synge or Oscar Wilde or G.B. Shaw. Now, a lot of people don't even know some of those guys are Irish, but also in the present, because we see somebody, let's say, like Sally Rooney, who is a major bookseller and major kind of a superstar. So the Irish achievement in the literary arts is driven by Hiberno English to some degree or
Yes.
other.
And I love the way you use the word flavor, because blas means
Mm-hmm.
flavor and accent. So people would say, blas ollie nuggets, you have a lovely accent or flavor to the way you speak. But I agree. I think we're seeing a plethora of new Irish writers. But this has been the way since publishing began. The Irish have a way of storytelling. And it's amazing when you think of the verb first quality. We start sentences with the verb in Irish. And that is sure to bring a sense of urgency and action and emotion to the beginning of a sentence. And the way we speak is very lyrical and musical, and even the syllables and the accent that we have speaking English, it all comes from the Irish language. So it's amazing to reflect on these influences and the impact that Irish has had on our culture and the way we write and create.
And yet Irish, which you also point out, is a language of great indirection in a way. And I got back to my father's thing with Knockwill on dinner Ray yet. Is the dinner not ready yet? And there's all sorts of other oddities that you point out in the book, that the Irish do not have a word for owning something.
Yeah.
To own something is not really part of the Irish experience, which unfortunately is somewhat true when you think about the relationship Irish people have with the land. But it seems to attach more to English. We're adjacent to things, it seems. So, for example, when we're dealing with feelings, they are upon us. Orm, we'll say, Tá brón orm, I am sad. Tá áthas orm, I am happy. It is upon me, but it is not me. So there is an extraordinary way of thinking when you step back and look at the language and understand how different it is than English.
Absolutely. Definitely, yes. And how English can seem to define us in certain ways, like with feelings, saying, I am sad. The English language has so many examples of that kind of trappings that Irish doesn't have. And it was interesting. A friend wrote to me, her dad actually wrote to me to thank me for the book and to praise me. And she said, that's interesting. My dad isn't one for praising. He's a typical Irish man of few words, not very emotional. And I said, he wrote in Irish. I wonder if that made a difference. Because I do write in the book that when Irish people express love or any sort of heightened emotion, it's difficult for us to do that in English. Even though generations have gone by where people are predominantly English speaking now, it feels like we're a lot more attuned to Irish emotions and being able to express things simply in Irish than in English.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, like how the loss of a language severs us from a way of being and stories and songs and emotions, it really, cuts us off from ways of being at home. Like Seamus Heaney said, that to speak Irish is to really, it's more human for us in a way. So it's only natural that it's jarring to speak English, to say real things.
Yeah, and that is something that is running through my thinking. When I was in Ireland in October and we were doing our podcast road trip, we were in the Midlands, and that's where Monaghan McCann made his home. And while we were there, he passed away, and Monaghan was a former guest on the podcast, and I only ever met him once in real life and once on the podcast, and I wish I'd met him more. But in the course of the podcast, he said something to the effect of me where what I think he was getting at was a different way to be Irish, that this was a time where he detected a energy or a fhuineamh was emerging. Now, he didn't have a full explanation for what it was, but things were shifting. And he and other people like him were looking at what does it mean to be Irish and how does the language connect it in that. Now, when I'm on the podcast, I introduced him as what I described as the most rooted Irish man that I know. And that's what he said, is he wanted to grow his own food. He wanted to live a sustainable life. He wanted to do what his ancestors did. He wanted to understand his culture in a deeper way. And language was one of those tools to get there. It wasn't the only thing. So when I asked you earlier, well, can you be Irish without speaking Irish? I believe, yes, you can, but I think it's an enriched experience if you can actually speak Irish. But I wonder if you have any reflections on the passing of Monaghan and his contributions to the language and culture and, his meaning in your life.
Yeah. At the Irish Book Awards, Aisling, his wife, collected the prize. He won one of the awards. And she said, Manchán was like a key holder who opened the door and showed us all the way so we could all walk through. And I felt this like abounding sense of gratitude and inspiration that so many people working in the language and inspired all the readers, all the people who followed him and knew about him and learned from him, really felt that he instilled some kind of confidence and enabled us to follow in his path and realize that this language is ours. And it's not how we learned it at school. It's in every hill and valley and flower and star, and it's part of the human experience. So he was hugely encouraging and stimulating. And I remember before I started Irish with Mollie and I was teaching one-to-ones on Zoom, I had this idea of doing a documentary and visiting my students around the world, because I had students in Hong Kong and Moscow and Alaska learning Irish. And I thought, this is fascinating. And people in Ireland don't believe me. They're like, who would want to learn Irish? This was before it was cool. And I wrote to Manchán and I said, he had so much experience making documentaries. And I said, what do you think of this idea? And he wrote back straight away. And he said, usually my heart falls because I know that RTE or TQ or any broadcaster won't have an interest or it won't be commissioned. But in your case, go for it. This is going to work. I'll back you all the way. Something like this. And I was so happy to hear back from him. And then we were on Skull Scarta together, which is a program about connecting. And it was really incredible. And you mentioned humility. And I think he had this great humility, this lifelong learning capacity, always open and curious and excited, childlike enthusiasm for what he was learning and what he was able to share. And yeah, his loss is unimaginable. And at the same time, he was so prolific and really gave us so many books and an amazing collection of his research and wisdom. So it's brilliant to have those at our fingertips and to remember him in that way. But I think he opened a new way, a very holistic way to treat the language and to connect ourselves with the land as well and what it means to be Irish.
Yeah, he's much missed, and it was interesting to see what was written in the months subsequent to his passing. Anybody I've talked to him about it, it's uniformly positive. There was no, nothing about this man there's no negative commentary at all, which is pretty unusual in our own. Hey, it's Martin. We'll be back with Mollie in a minute, but first, a quick side note. 10 episodes, that's how many times the Irish language has shown up as a central theme in Irish Stew episodes, which probably tells you something about us and our belief in this new revival of the Irish language. If this conversation has you curious, or guilty, or both, which is the traditional Irish response to the language, all 10 episodes are gathered in one place at irishstewpodcast.com/categories/Irish-language. Now, that's a pretty long link, so I'll post it in the show notes. No excuses now. Agus anish. Erai, Arash, Huig Mollie. Let's get back to Mollie. To some degree, my efforts in the language were unfortunately triggered by Monacon's passing, because I think it become more incumbent on us now. As his wife Aisling said, he provided us the key, we just have to walk through the door. And so I said, okay, now I'm going to make more of an effort, because he's not here to move forward, and we all have to live his ideas if we believe that is a more valid way or a better way of being Irish. And I think it's important in our conversation to talk about some of the fallacies that surround the language. For example, Irish is a very hard language to learn. And in your book, you point out, for example, that Irish is actually far more structured than English, meaning
Yes,
the number of irregular verbs, for example, is a lot smaller in Irish than it is in English. The
exactly.
rules that surround, so for example, when do you use the shevu, the H, or when then you don't? That was never taught to me. It was somehow you were meant to figure it out by sniffing through the wind. But your
I
book does
know.
an immensely good job of putting these things together, I think. And when I read the book, I read it to some degree for pleasure, to some degree to learn, but I knew when I was reading it that I was going to go back and refer to it. So when I need to master where to put the shevu, I know there's a chapter in the Gaeilge book that kind of explains that very clearly to me. But talk about Irish as a language that is not as hard because of things like when we see it, the words spelt out, they look difficult to pronounce, and talk about the lens through which people look at Irish.
I agree. I think the lens is skewed by our English centric brains. So we are English speakers. We're having this conversation in English. We were raised through English. And English is a deeply unpatterned, illogical, orthographically deep language that doesn't connect much with how it looks. And yet, because we're fluent in it, we think English is easy, or because it's a dominant world language spoken by so many people around the world and leading the way in TV and radio and music, we think English is easy. But Irish makes a lot more sense. It's a very consistent and patterned, logical, orthographically shallow language, meaning that every time you see the letter C, for example, it sounds like K, a Coca-Cola K, hard C sound, whereas in English, that C, letter C has about 8 different sounds. So it's just a sense of shifting this paradigm or this mindset to say, okay, I'll accept that. Or first I have to accept that it's confusing, get my head around it. It's something new. It's a necessary part of the journey to take that leap and go, okay, different language. It's like a different world. Let me enjoy it. I'm not going to be scared. I'm going to just jump in and see how it reveals itself, because it very much reveals itself over time. So there are lots of misconceptions about the language, that it's useless when actually it's very good for our memory, concentration, discipline, self-esteem, creativity. It boosts academic performance in all areas, but also it's very good for our mental health and the way we see the world. And it's very good for solutions-based thinking. Bilingualism and learning any language is excellent for the brain, but especially one that is rooted in Indigenous insights and ancestry and those connections. So people might think that Irish is backwards, but actually it's just a different structure, a different syntax. And in fact, Irish is closer to other languages in many ways. We put the noun after the adjective in English, like we would say big house. But in Irish, we'd say house big, teach more. And a lot of languages like French and Spanish do that. So I suppose it's about taking that leap and just realizing the truth of it, because there's so many fallacies, like you said, that fill our minds because we're a bit scared of it. And of course, when something is alien, we want to block it off or talk negatively about it or even say untruths about it. But there are so many incredible things about the language that we never learned at school. It's pretty mind-blowing to go through 14 years of daily Irish classes and not know the meaning behind hello and goodbye, and just use them, and even be able to get an A in the exams and do the best in the year or excel, and not actually root yourself in the language and not know what you're saying. And like you said, have to realize, oh, I just need to memorize to know where the shevu goes, instead of knowing there's actually a list of rules and reasons and patterns that will make sense. So it is interesting. And I think that's what I love about teaching and enlightening myself and other people and realizing this path through the woods. Interestingly, the language itself comes from Gaeilge, this Proto-Celtic word widus, meaning of the woods or of the wild. And the British destroyed the woods as well. Ireland was an Atlantic rainforest. And because of treating it like pastures for cows and cattle, it just was destroyed. But I think Irish people are growing in confidence and realizing, okay, who are we and what's important? It feels like moments like the Celtic Tiger, new money all of a sudden didn't really suit Irish people. There's all these stories of having more helicopters being bought in Ireland than anywhere in the world at that time. And now I think Irish people are going back to Aran jumpers and poaching and stuff and really appreciating trad music and the language and focusing on what's real to us. It's no wonder that Killa is the #1 song of the year from 2025, this song about community and the GAA and home. So it's a really exciting time, and it's fascinating to reflect on people who've carved that path, like Manchán McGann, and talking to your brother on my podcast yesterday, people who've been in love with the language and inspiring the next generation their whole life long have really enabled people like me to take up the torch and shine it onwards.
So thank you for the shout out for my brother Stefan. And of course, Molly, since we last had her on the podcast, has launched her own podcast, which is wonderful. And there's great conversations on there to understand all sorts of themes and how they are reflected in the language or how they're being dealt with through the language. Big shout out there. And I will make sure to put a link in our notes to Molly's podcast as also her book. But unfortunately, we're at that point where we have to say slán. But before we go, what's the next big project? You have a new podcast, you have a new book. What else have you got in plan for us?
So, yes, I'm working on the advanced course. So, there's now a beginner course, intermediate course, daily conversations course, and the advanced course is slowly but surely coming together. And I've started running retreats. So it's an immersive 5-day experience in a Gaeltacht island. It was on Inishmore and will be again this year. Tickets sold out in about 6 hours. So it's a really popular thing. But it's a beautiful way to connect and live life through the language. So things like hiking and knitting and singing and swimming all through Irish. But I'd love also to combine my love of dance with Irish. So I was a Zumba teacher. And I think dancing is a great way to forget your learning and forget your troubles and to learn simple words and phrases and get fit at the same time. So it sounds like a joke right now, and maybe it is, but I think it'd be fun to make a few dance videos and help people that way too.
So with that, and of course I'll put a link into your website as well in our show notes, so folks make sure that you look out for all those links. And of course you will find the episode page for this episode on irishstewpodcast.com, or maybe instead of dot, I should be saying punk, I believe. Is that the right word? Punk, which is or in Ireland we would say full stop. In America we would say period, or we can just stick with the dot. But you will find all the links to the book, etc., in our show notes. And on behalf of myself and our listeners, Tarm Ra Gurmila Mahagat, Molly, for coming on the Irish Stew podcast a second time and letting us know what is new and exciting in your life. To thank you very much. It's been a joy, and want to encourage all our listeners. There are many different ways to engage in being Irish, and that one very accessible way is through our teanga, our language, on Gaeilge, the Irish. That is doable. It is far easier than many people would tell you. So thank you, Gurmila Mahagat.
Gurmila Mahagat.
That's it for today's episode with Mollie Guidera. And if you're walking away from this one with a slightly different relationship to the Irish language than when you started listening, then we've done our job. We got into the Gaeilge guide published by Hachette Books. We talked about the shame and the regret that so many Irish people carry around the language. What Hiberno English tells us about who we really are. The radical idea that Irish is not about the past, but about the future. And what we lost when Moncan Magan left us. And what he left behind. If this landed for you, here's what I'd ask. Share it with one person. Not a broadcast, not a repost. Just send it directly to someone you think needs to hear it. That's how the Irish stew grows. Word of mouth, person to person, which is fittingly, exactly how a language survives. You'll find all the details of this episode at irishstewpodcast.com. And so now, Gura Mahagat, and we'll see you next time. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Martin Nutty. Additional editing by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.